In this video, we're going to look at styling tables and the things that you can do to make your tables look better without using some of the attributes that we looked at earlier in the course. The style sheet properties that are commonly used with the table, TD, and TH elements would include a border, the padding. The border obviously is around the table or around the cell. Just by putting border in the table doesn't mean it's going to go around everything, as we'll see here later. It's going to go around the table itself. The padding is the amount of space, we've talked about this before, between the border of a table cell and its content, so it makes things a little bit easier to read. As far as dealing with the text and fonts, you could use the text align, vertical align, which is the top, middle, or bottom of a cell, the width, the height, the background color, and the background image. These are all things that we've looked at already that you should be familiar with. With the exception of background color and height properties, it's best to avoid using most of the text and font properties with TR elements. And that's because of inconsistency between different browsers on the support of those properties within a TR element. So if you look at an example here, we just have a simple table. It's got a caption, it's got several rows, um, some THs as the headers and so on. But you'll notice the one thing in here, they all have the class of code. Well, in all four of these cells where we have the class of code, we're going to deal with font family, font size, font style, and font weight. And we're going to do that through the CSS this time instead of through each individual cell. First thing to note is some things that we're setting for the table. We're giving the table a background color, this will be applied to the entire table. Setting the width to 350. That's important to know because without that it would take up as much of the screen that is needed to show as much text as possible on one line. We're also setting the border. As I said before, that none of the other cells in the table inherit that. It's just a border for the table itself. So we're going to make it solid, 1 pixel, and 999999, which I believe is a dark gray. I could be wrong. And we're setting the font family for the entire table in here as well. We also have styling for the caption that we have. It's going to set the font weight, text align, border style, the border width, and the border color. So the caption will have a border around it as well. The text align left should be of interest to you because by default a border or a caption is centered. It is also not normally bold, so we're changing a couple of the styles that are part of the caption and making them something different than what they would be by default. We then have the TH selectors. We're going to give all those a height. Set the font weight to bold, the text align to left. Again, remember this is normally centered, and the background color to a gray. Then for all the TDs and THs, we're going to set the padding to 5 pixels so that none of the text in any of the cells is up against anything. So it's 5 pixels all the way around for all the TDs and all the THs. The class that we looked at, the TD with a class of code, we're going to set the width of each cell to 150 pixels. That's going to ensure that the whole column remains on one line. There's no way to assign a style to a column, but in the case of the width property, after it's been set on one element, it does not need to be set on the others. So all the columns then, or all the cells in that column, would inherit the maximum width of any one column. Then we're changing the font family, font weight. It's not normally bold, as you know. The text align to right, it would normally be left. And the vertical line to top, this would normally be middle. In a browser, then you can see that indeed we added a border up here around the caption. We've also made the font bold. The THs are aligned left instead of centered. The first row of TDs, the width of 150 has taken over there, and these are all aligned right and aligned top. You might also notice, because we're going to talk about this in just a few minutes, the space is here, and you see a little bit of space here. You also see it on the sides here because of the background color that we used. This is actually what we would have referred to as cell padding if we were using attributes. So we're going to talk about that. In order to control that spacing that I just showed you in a style sheet, as opposed to using that cell spacing attribute for the table, you need to use the border collapse property. So this is going to handle wherever two table cells meet. You can tell the browser to either show just one of the borders or tell it not to show any of them, to eliminate the space between. The border collapse property has two values. It can be collapse, which means the horizontal borders collapse and the vertical borders abut one another, or you can use separate, where separate rules are observed. The value opens up additional properties that we'll look at as well that give you further control. Those additional properties then, when you have it set as separate, are border spacing and empty cells, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So if we look at an example here again, we have two tables. First one has a class of 1, and we're going to collapse those cells. We'll look at this AB and BA. We're kind of doing these back and forth. You'll see in just a minute. And on the second table, we're using the class of 2. And then individually, we got two classes for the TDs, either class A or class B, and we're just alternating them in these tables. In the style sheet, you can see then for table 1, we're using the border collapse, and for table 2, we're using the border collapse separate. Then for our TDs that have an A, we're using a dotted border style. Is 3 pixels in width. It's black, and it's 10 pixels of padding, where the ones with the B have a solid border style. They're 3 pixels as well, has a different color, and the same 10 pixels of padding. The table, all we've done with the table is add a margin to the bottom to separate the two tables. So again, if we look at this in our browser, you can see the difference between these. Now this is the one that's got it collapsed. Notice that the horizontal and vertical lines are actually on top of each other. There's a dotted line in here as well as a solid line. You don't see the dotted line across here or down here because you've got the dotted line on top of a solid line and they're both the same color. With the separate though, you can see that there is space between and you get the full border all the way around. So they're not sitting on top of each other, we're separating them. And the border collapse again, just like cell spacing, it adds room between the different cells. And again, you can see that here along this line and along the horizontal line. The spacing that's there, that is not there here or here. Now the border spacing that I just spoke of specifies the distance that separates adjacent cells' borders. So not only can you tell it to separate, but you can determine how much of separation you want. In this example here, we're going to make that spacing 15 pixels. That spacing here, because there's only one value, would apply to both the vertical as well as the horizontal spacing. You can give this same property two values, where the first one is going to be for horizontal spacing and the second one is going to be for vertical spacing. So if they're all the same, you only need to use one value. If you want them different, then you could use two values. So again, we have the same table that we looked at before in this example. The difference is in the CSS. And for the two tables, you can see that the difference here are that the first one has 15 pixel spacing, the second one has a 2 pixel horizontal, 8 pixel vertical. And you may say, well, you didn't set the border collapse to separate. And you're right, we didn't, because that's what it is by default. So by default, a table is going to separate its table cells, so you wouldn't necessarily have to use border dash collapse colon separate, because that is the default. Most time you're going to see this, and it's going to be setting it as collapse. So when we run this, then you see the 15 pixels in between the cells here, and down here you can see just the 2 pixel, while across is 8 pixels. So you can see how that works. The other property that can be used when you have the default border collapse set to separate is empty cells. And this just indicates whether a cell without any content should have a border displayed or not. There's 3 possible values. Show just shows the borders even if the cell is empty, and that's the default value. Hide, the borders are hidden if a cell is empty. And then you also have inherit, where the borders obey the rules of the containing table, provided it is a nested table. See, here we have a table then with 3 rows. Each row has 3 cells in it. Notice that we have a TH here that's empty. We also have a TD down here that is empty, no content. In our style sheet then, the empty cells is for the table. So we're going to do a border collapse separate, and then we're going to do empty cells hide. So they're not going to have a border. You can then see when we run this that the TH has no border around it, nor does that last TD tag. All the other ones. The spacing is still there, they just do not have borders. Would it make a difference if we put a non-breaking space in there? Use a character entity, put that non-breaking space in there, refresh this page now, and you see now it has a space in it, so we actually get that border. So if you have an empty one but you want the border around it, and you've got the empty set to hide, then you can put a non-breaking space in there and you'll get the border back. You can also control what side the caption goes on. The caption side property is used for the caption element to indicate which side of it you want it on. It's at the top by default, top and centered, you should remember that, but you could also set it to the right, bottom, and left. Right and left I've never used because they really don't look the way you would want it to, and very seldom do you see that done, but I do use the bottom quite a bit. See, here we have caption in here with font properties, cells just like we had before, and in our CSS for the caption now we have a font weight of bold, text align left, which is different than what it should be, setting the border for it, and we have the caption side on the bottom instead of on the top. So you can see then that bordered, bold, left aligned caption is now on the bottom. So what if we wanted to put this caption on one of the sides? Let's see exactly what happens to it. We'll change the bottom to the right, save it, and refresh our page, and you can then see what it does. And this width becomes somewhat ambiguous. You're never sure exactly what it's going to be. Usually it's the longest word. You could use style sheets to set the width of that as well and set the height, but for me I very rarely see that used, bottom or top, but it can be. I'm not saying it's wrong to use it, just saying I don't normally see that. And then lastly we have a table layout property. This is fairly new, and it enables you to force the browser to stick with the width you specify even if it makes the content unreadable. Table layout takes 3 values: auto, With the auto, the browser looks through the entire table for the widest unbreakable content in the cells and sets things that way. This is a little slower at rendering, but more useful if you don't know the exact size of each column. And this is what it does by default. It just makes itself as big as it needs to for its content. With the fixed, the width of the table cell depends on the widths you specified for the table and its cells. This makes things load a little bit faster, although with computers these days and the browsers it's not, and the download speeds, it's not as slow as you might think. And then you also have the inherit, which obeys the rules of the containing table, but once again only if it's in nested tables. So you can see here we just have a simple table with a class of 1. It has one row, one cell, and has a fair amount of text in it. We have a second table underneath of it, the exact same thing, only it has a class of 2. So if we look at the CSS, you'll see that table 1, the layout is going with auto. Table 2, we're setting it at fixed. With all that, also notice that the width of the table has been set to 75. So even though we had a width of 75 set, this made this cell as long as its longest unbreakable word. And if you remember, there was a space between the W and the X in the text that was put in there. So it broke it at that space, put it on 2 lines, made the width accordingly. In this one, it maintained the 75 pixel width, causing content to spill out of it. So it's probably, you're going to have to look at this and be very careful at how you use it. The auto in this first case overrode the 75 pixels. The second one, it maintained the 75 pixels and allowed the content to flow out of it. So those are properties and ways of doing with the table through cascading style sheets.